Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Chris. I don't have my, yeah, there we go. So I'll be speaking to you about the work that we've been doing with NMDMT and more recently 5-MeO-DMT, where we're going with the research, and try to condense it around some sort of essential ideas that I think are important. And these revolve about why is DMT important for the understanding of the mind or consciousness research more broadly, and what can neuroscience tell us about that as well. And I'd just like to start with a brief note of gratitude. My journey in psychedelic science really begins in Breaking Convention in 2013. I was an attendee at that conference 10 years ago, and it really introduced me into the whole field. And just last month, we published the first resting state fMRI neuroimaging study of DMT. So yeah, huge gratitude to this conference for really being a part of that as well. All right, so let's begin with what we've done in the past and how we're currently understanding DMT. So just a very brief overview. DMT has been used as part of ritual sacraments and ceremonial settings in the form of ayahuasca or as part of snuffs in the American continent for hundreds and possibly even thousands of years. That's what we know of the snuffs. So there's a rich contextual and cultural history around DMT, also beyond the Western world. However, in the Western context, when injected or smoked, and when injected in a fast-acting fashion with a bolus, for example, it induces very short-acting but intense psychological effects. So it's really an ideal way for us to probe into this alteration of consciousness in controlled environments, such as neuroimaging environments, where we're scanning the brain while people are having this very immersive and interesting trip. What we've also found out, this is something that we've known for a while, a bit in psychedelic research, is that essential to its effects is the serotonin 2A receptor in the brain. This mechanism that if we know we block, we prevent psychedelic effects from happening. And also to mention, I think very importantly, that the research that we're doing is also standing on the shoulders of previous research, human DMT research. So we have the case of the late Stephen Sarah, who first synthesized and tried DMT on his own, intramuscular, and did several experiments in the 1950s. And the other research endeavor really worth mentioning is the important work by Rick Strassman in the 1990s. So at Imperial, we've performed over the past 7 years 3 experiments, lab experiments involving DMT, trying to image DMT, understand what it does to the mind and the brain. The first is this EEG study, electroencephalogram. It provides a view of the brain with not so very good resolution, but a good sense of what's happening in time, good temporal resolution. We did that 2016 and 2017. We performed this first neuroimaging study with combined fMRI that gives you a good spatial resolution of where things are happening in the brain, combined with EEG in 2018 and 2019. And as of late, we've finalized the first extended infusion study of DMT, looking how we can extend that very remarkable experience in 30 minutes, the peak of that DMT state. So I'm going to speak about all of these studies today. So as an overview, our aims, why we are interested in the molecule and doing research with the molecule, revolves around consciousness research. Or if you will, in what way can DMT provide insights into the minds, into the mechanisms of the mind, and maybe possibly into the fundamental mechanisms of the mind. And psychedelics are very well poised to do this because, on the one hand, they induce these very intimate, subjective, some call ineffable experiences. And at the same time, they depend on very specific pharmacological mechanisms. So it's a really interesting way for us to explore this explanatory gap that separates mind and body, or mind and brain. And the essential question that we are also trying to answer is whether or not this exploration can provide some form of insight into the nature of minds. My proposal is that it does. And it does because it allows us to construct and deconstruct worlds of experience. It deconstructs our usual way of experiencing the world, and instead, that way of experiencing the world is replaced by another construction, another world of experience that arises during the trip. We can think of this idea of deconstruction as a form of parenthesis of our naive understanding of the world. From the phenomenological tradition, this is usually called the natural attitude, the way that our thoughts, our cognitive processes, our emotions, many of these things run implicitly in our engagement with the external world. And we take the external world to be really just very strong representation, something that we can somehow conjure up very easily, just reflect as a mirror in our minds. Very much supported by phenomenological traditions, I propose that DMT in a way allows us to deconstruct that naive understanding of external perception and instead allows us to construct a novel world, a novel experience. Psychedelics are amplifiers of meaning. They construct novel ways of generating meaning. These experiences usually have a strong attribution of truth or reality to them. They allow us to reify also novel worlds of experience. They provide a sense that the experience is more real than real. So we deconstruct that naive way of experiencing the world and construct another world of experience. One way that we can understand the idea of the deconstruction of experience via brain mechanisms could be maybe under the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics hypothesis proposed by Robin Carhart Harris. So in this hypothesis builds upon this predictive processing idea, this notion that contrary to our conventional, the way that we used to think about how the world processed information or the engagement with reality as this passive receiver of information of the world out there, rather the brain is actively trying to construct and predict a world. What psychedelics would do is that they would relax these beliefs, these models, these constructions of the usual way in which we engage with the world, and instead allow us to construct a novel world of experience via the introduction of novel information coming from other brain systems that are usually dampened or inhibited in our normal day-to-day experience. And we have some evidence with DMT suggesting that this indeed could be the case. So with the use of traveling waves that we can capture with EEG from the front to the back of the brain, so backward traveling waves, or from the back to the front of the brain, forward traveling waves, we think that we can somehow represent or somehow measure the encoding of the influence of these models, the usual way that we construct the world, and the idea of a novel world that is being constructed with forward traveling waves. And indeed, we see that DMT reduces the influence of these backward traveling waves, these models that usually are involved in the construction of our world of experience, and instead enhance forward traveling waves, the idea of novel information arising in the experience. We also have seen evidence with DMT that another two different brain mechanisms that are also very much responsible to encoding models, priors, or beliefs, the usual way in which the brain has learned to engage with the world, are significantly reduced or dampened in the DMT experience. That concerns alpha waves, brain waves, and activity in the default mode network. Both of these brain mechanisms are thought to encode our usual stories or models of the world. And we see that they are very much strongly reduced during the DMT experience. So while we have some evidence showing that there is a lot of deconstruction happening in the brain throughout this DMT trip, at the same time, if we look at the phenomenology of the DMT experience, we see that there's a lot of construction happening that usual way of experiencing that we deconstruct is replaced by a novel world of experience. And we can think of key terms or specific keywords around that phenomenology that give us a hint around these novel world that is constructed. We can think of, for example, the idea of entities as some form of order that is arising in the DMT experience, a sense of immersion into a different reality or dimension. Or more broadly, we can think of this state of construction as a form of virtual reality that arises in the DMT experience. Our latest fMRI findings with DMT show that in the DMT experience, there's a strong dysregulation of what we call high-level systems in the brain in the DMT trip. These high-level systems have to do with planning, decision-making, and very importantly also has to do with imagination, the way that we make stories out of the world. And we think, to some extent, that the engagement of these systems are key for somehow allowing the development of this virtual reality or this construction of a novel world of experience under DMT. So again, if we look at the brain as this kind of like gradient of organization, in one pole of the brain organization, we have the areas and the systems that process information coming from the outside world. At the other pole of that hierarchy or organization, we have areas and systems of the brain that are more related to the way that we build models or build stories out of the world. We see that this hierarchy is collapsed and the sensory systems are working closer to these high-level systems of the stories. And we think, again, that this somehow relates to the construction of a novel world of experience. Yes, so let's just skip that. And we see that these high-level systems that get very strongly dysregulated during the DMT trip also have a strong overlap with systems in the brain and areas of the brain that have to do with abstract semantic processing. Again, returning to this idea that there's somehow a strong connection between language, semantics, the way that we build stories out of our experience, and what gets dysregulated to generate a novel story, novel world of experience during DMT trips. So we can think about this construction of a world of experience happening at the level of sensory information, the feeling of immersion or feeling of contact with entities or beings. But we can also think about this idea of a construction of a world of experience at high levels of cognition that have to do with meaning making and attribution of truth or what feels real and fundamental to our conscious waking experience. So we can see, for example, that DMT experiences have been linked to mystical states, spiritual-like experiences, non-dual experiences sometimes, and also, very importantly, also near-death-like experiences. All these experiences have to do, we think, based on the data, to this core unitive experience in which everything seems to be perceived under a single percept. We can think of the unitive experience as a paradigmatic example of the feeling of construction or constructing a world of experience, attributing some form of meaning or reality to that experience. And we can even also dive in deeper into the high-level systems around this idea of construction. And we've found some evidence, for example, that ayahuasca, for example, that contains DMT, can deconstruct our worldviews, our usual beliefs about how the world and reality operates. So we see these reductions in non-physicalist metaphysical beliefs or worldviews, and instead we see a construction, a novel engagement of new systems of beliefs, such as panpsychism. And very intriguingly, we see that the distribution of the serotonin 2A receptor, the psychedelic receptor in the brain, is engaged not only in the visual systems in the brain, but very also strongly engaged in these high-level systems, in the areas that have to do with planning, decision-making, and so on, areas that are related to human evolution, the uniquely human attributes that allow us, once again, to have a narrative semantic world via which we construct worlds of shared reality, for example. I'm going to skip that. So now I'm going to go into the present, what we're doing right now, what we're interested and working on at this moment when it comes to DMT research. So we find that the DMT experience is actually quite rich. There's a lot going on. This has been the result of a lot of phenomenological work that we've been doing over the past years. And while we usually think about the DMT experience as many times this monolithic experience of this engagement with these entities or beings, we actually can start seeing its full complexity. And what we're doing is taking a kind of like a neuroscientific approach that's a bit different from the conventional approach. So the common approach to the way in which we do neuroscience is we take a state A of experience, your normal way of experiencing the world of reality. We perturb it with an injection of DMT, and then we generate some form of average activity of what's happening in that trip. That would be the state B. What we're doing is taking a neurophenomenological approach in which we are trying to characterize the richness and diversity of these states, both within the individual in time or different stages and phases of the DMT trip, for example, as well as between individuals. We see that the experiences are very valuable. Many people see entities, many people do not, for example. And the way that we do this is by inviting personal experience or phenomenology into the lab. So we take experience seriously, and we try to take it as seriously as the way that we quantify brain activity or natural mechanisms that we can observe in science. And we think that this will allow us to identify substates of different stages of the DMT experience. So, for example, our initial phenomenological work, we've identified that there's an initial stage of the DMT experience that has to do with this feeling of immersion, in which sensory systems are engaged. There's a visual component to the experience. There's a bodily component to the experience. And then this is followed, after that intense bit is over, by a stage of elaboration, making sense, putting narrative over that experience. This would be a very broad characterization of the experiences. Preliminary work led by Lorenzo Paschini is showing how in this very preliminary findings, but it's showing that in this initial state of immersion, we see a reduction of engagement of systems related to the default mode network, our narrative sense of self, and instead increased engagement of sensory and salience systems that also have to do a lot with embodied cognition. The general idea would be that this state of immersion has a relationship with our embodied feeling of being in that place, in that DMT hyperspace, for example. And in this next stage of elaboration, of narrative, making meaning out of that experience, we see rather that there's a flipping of this activity, and there's increased engagement of areas related to the default mode network, related to narrative and meaning making and making sense out of an experience, and decreased activity, for example, in the insula that is involved in embodied cognition. So we see more a metacognitive component of that experience somehow being engaged in the DMT trip. And with this idea of substates and identifying different bits of the DMT experience, we also hope to get to the bottom of what may be going on in the brain, the neural correlates of these entity experiences. So this is work that we're currently doing. Also would like to introduce some of our extended DMT research. This work has been led by Lisa Luan, PhD student at the DMT research group. In this work, we have sought to extend the DMT trip, that bolus infusion that usually lasts 2 to 5 minutes, the intense bit, and extend that peak over 30 minutes by employing continuous infusion, giving a short bolus at the beginning and then giving a slow drip so that we're able to maintain individuals in hyperspace, if you will, for a long time, so that we can explore the mind a bit more and potentially maybe even see the therapeutic applications of flexible dosings around DMT could have. So we found that different infusion parameters generate different levels of intensity of this DMT trip over time. But broadly, what we found is that we have managed to extend that DMT experience, the peak of that DMT experience, for at least 30 minutes, while also keeping anxiety levels relatively low. So this is one of the main concerns, that this DMT experience, the extended experience, could be quite jarring and challenging. Our results are encouraging, suggesting that it's psychologically safe. And also very interestingly, we found that while at the beginning of the DMT experience, heart rate increases, there's some autonomic engagement, that heart rate normalizes even when people are still reporting high levels of intensity, suggesting that the DMT experience is not only psychologically safe, but possibly also very much physiologically safe, really opening the doors for a lot of further research into extended DMT infusions. When looking at specific aspects of that experience, how features of this experience evolve over time, we find that the feeling of immersion, feeling of entity encounters, and visual imagery, all of these key characteristics that we are interested when it comes to DMT experiences, they become very much elevated and many times sustained over 30 minutes. Intriguingly, we found that ego dissolution was kept relatively low throughout the infusion, suggesting that ego dissolution, unlike other psychedelics, appears to be a bit less engaged in the DMT trip. And then finally, when measuring the levels of DMT in the blood throughout this extended infusion, we found that while at the beginning there was a peak of DMT levels in the blood, then they slowly rose up, and the highest level were found at the end of the infusion. And this is somewhat contrary to what we find with the intensity ratings, what people tell how intense the experience is over time. And we found somewhat of a discrepancy there, suggesting that there is some form of psychological tolerance or habituation developing throughout the DMT experience, something that wasn't found before. So far, we tend to think that DMT does not generate any form of tolerance. And it's possible that these results are pointing towards the notion that there's immediate tolerance being developed to some extent. And for the future, what are we interested now? If you go back to this idea of deconstructing and reconstructing a world under DMT, right? One way that we can think about this idea is that the DMT experience is a state also of construction. It generates a lot of content, a lot of stuff is going on in that DMT experience. However, if we have a substance such as 5-MeO-DMT, it seems as if the main mechanism at play is more one of deconstruction of human experience, a stripping away of the contents of usual experience, leading to a state that has been described in other practices and traditions as experiences of non-duality or pure awareness, indicating possibly that there is some form of access, possibly, without getting too esoteric, to some form of fundamental or elemental form of consciousness that can be achieved in the 5-methoxy-DMT state. And this is also arising several other questions that we're interested in and that we're planning to do research in the future. For example, what is the overlap between advanced meditation practices that we can consider, for example, non-dual meditation, with these forms of contentless experiences that are arising in the DMT trip, in the 5-MeO-DMT trip, right? The general idea that has been proposed again in these non-dual meditation states, and you can see this in the diagram there, is that the complexity of human experience, the fractal elaboration at the top of that tree, is deconstructed into some form of elementary form of awareness, perception, or being in the world. So again, we're interested in this perennial question, whether or not these different etiologies or states of consciousness induced by different means can provide access to some form of fundamental awareness or consciousness. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank all the people that contributed in the research, especially PhD students, Lisa Luan, the new PhD student, Tommaso Barba, interns such as James Sanders, all the medics that participated in the research, colleagues, David Nuts, Robin Carhart-Harris, Leo Roseman, of course. I don't know why Robin is not here. Well, Robin Carhart-Harris, that was my mistake. He should be also very much thanked. He was a supervisor in a lot of this work. And our collaborators, Chris Leatherby, Malin, Dave Luke, Jack Aloka, and of course, the important contribution, intellectual and financial, from Anton Bilton, Patrick Vernon, Amanda Fielding. And yes, thank you very much for your attention.